the question is, with when Luckin kind of imploded here, I immediately had this thought like, oh, maybe this is big enough to kind of get the message to people that Carson knows what he's talking about, or that the people that have been skeptical of this space know what they're talking about, and that these companies really are not what they say that they are. And, maybe people will understand that, the lack of due diligence that goes into these companies before they list and things like that. And then, here we are 2-3 days later, and I'm watching all these Chinese names. I watched Tal come out and expose, another company that you've written about. I watched Tal come out and admit, hey, we're overstating this, that, and the other thing by a couple of percent. And, the stock pretty much goes green on the news, right? It goes down to 40. It comes all the way back up. Today it's, I think it was trading at 53, 54, which is where it was before they even announced that they were doing anything fraudulently. So my question is twofold. First is, why are these companies coming out now and quote unquote admitting this stuff like Luckin did, like Tal did? I think it's an interesting question. My friend asked me that and I didn't have an answer. And my second part of that question is, what is it going to take to shake people hard enough to realize that we just shouldn't be fucking with any of these companies without at least doing extraordinarily rigorous due diligence?
Right. Okay. Let me answer the second one first, because, on the China side, or maybe it's a question you didn't quite ask, but it goes back to what I said a couple of minutes ago. And that is, the guys who are along this know that these are frauds. They don't care. Okay. The person who wrote that report, is very, very smart guy, only does China. He does China long, short. Okay, he knows that these companies are fraud. So, when we were talking months ago about something, he said to me, he's like, oh, Carson, you really should write a long report on Tao and on New Oriental. And I said to him, I'm like, bro, that we shorted both of those because they're frauds. He said, yes, but, you lost a lot of credibility over here for that. And, I said, well, they are frauds. He said, yes, but they're good companies. Like, they're frauds, but they are good companies and they are growing. And, but this is the same guy who can turn around and write this Luckin report, and, this is a big fraud, blah, blah, blah. And the reason for that is, he's just very typical of this space. If a company is lying about up to 30% of its revenue in China, in the China space, that's a real company. Like, that's as real as any company will get is, 70 to 80% top line reality. And that's acceptable. But yeah, if you cross the 50% threshold, well, then it's a problem. So the guys who run China long, short, most, guys except for Jim Oberweis Jr., who I don't think is in on the joke, but, everybody else I think is, and this includes basically, all your page one holders of Luckin. The strategy is go long the good frauds, go short the bad frauds. And, what would change that? Well, we can expose frauds all we want, but if nobody thinks there's a risk to holding them, then it actually is like, well, since the financials are bullshit, they're not going to miss numbers. They're going to grow very fast on paper. So it becomes this incredibly surreal risk calculus for the holders, which is, well, yeah, fine. Muddy Waters just tweeted this report out. Yeah, I looked at the report. Yeah, I believe it. Looks like real work went into it. Who's going to do anything about this? Who cares? And I think what happened in this case was the auditor cared. And people misunderstand auditors' roles. Literally, they are not there to find fraud. But what ended up happening, and it's an unfortunate, the consequences of this are really unfortunate. But in the first wave of China fraud exposures and delistings that began in 2010, got to this point where the SEC was demanding audit working papers from the China affiliates of the Big Four and I think BDO. And those China affiliates were saying, look, there's the state secrets law here. People can go to prison if we provide this information to you, the SEC. We really can't do that. So the SEC then went to the global parents, or at least the U.S. affiliates, and said, okay, we want these papers. And they said, well, we don't have them. That's the local affiliate. So the SEC then sued these affiliates, and an administrative law judge in the SEC court ruled that if they weren't willing to provide the audit working papers in these 5 or 6 matters, that the local affiliates would lose their registration in the U.S., which could have meant, depending on when the audits hit, relative to the deregistration, that a bunch of these companies would have been delisted. And this is where the Obama administration really didn't understand the leverage that they had with respect to delistings of China companies, because it's not like China needs the U.S. capital markets so they can feed these companies so that they can generate economic growth. They don't need that. I mean, that's not what I think really drives the decision-making here. What really drives the decision-making is that policymakers, through their families, own huge amounts of these, through their families who have proxies, own huge amounts of these companies. It's PS. I suspect a lot of them water their stock all day, in Cayman. But I think that's the leverage that the government has, is like, hey, you think you've got, $3.2 billion worth of holdings of U.S. listed China companies. How about we just delist these fuckers and your holdings are basically, gone, or if they're, valuable in theory only. That would change. That's real leverage. That would change a lot of behavior. But that never happened. The Obama administration prioritized, whatever else in the China relationship. The threat receded. The SEC has been very frustrated trying to deal with these companies because, just when you think about the amount of resources an investigation consumes, getting all these documents translated from Chinese into English.
Sure, yeah.
And the SEC can't compel the production of many documents. I mean, they can't get SAIC filings unless, say, I provide it to them, because they would have to make a request through the State Department to Chinese Foreign Ministry, which then would go to blah, 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 and they just can't do that. I mean, for these investigations. So, and the other thing is the SEC, I mean, they had all these investigations going, and at the end of the day, no mainland chairman went to prison. Everybody settled for pennies on the dollar, and it was wholly unsatisfying for the SEC. And so I think that when you're a page one holder of Luckin, this. You're like, and so going back to the auditor issue, though, so what happened to the auditors was they learned that if we really start pulling the plug on these China frauds, we're going to be caught between a rock and a hard place, because the U.S. government is going to demand the audit papers. We're not going to be able to comply, and then we're going to get, potentially fucked a lot harder than, the next time. So the auditors really, what they learned was, don't look for fraud. So I don't know what happened with EY here and why they pulled the plug.
It's like the end of Burn After Reading, when the guy's sitting around, he's like, well, what did we learn from all this? And everybody's just like looking at each other like, fuck, I have no idea.
Well, it's like the whole, no good deed goes unpunished. Like, right. I guess that's true here, fellas. I mean, if I want to auto-filate here, maybe the reason why it happened in this case was, we just exposed in December a FTSE 100 company listed in London, had a $7 billion U.S. market cap. We exposed that as a fraud. That was NMC Health. It's based in Abu Dhabi. But, so that thing, after our report, unwound really fast. And so they had reported $2.1 billion in debt. But it turns out that the real total is over $6.5 billion. So they had all this, illegally concealed debt. And, EY was the auditor there. So EY is just getting absolutely beaten up, or they know they're going to get completely beat up over this. And by the way, they were the auditor of Sinoforce. So maybe, when we tweeted out that Luckin report, maybe, somebody, on the U.S. side, or a senior partner in China was just like, look,
Fucking
guys,
light bulb went off.
like let's be the heroes this time instead
Right.
of the assholes left holding the bag. Again, that's maybe me just performing auto fellatio, but I don't know what happened there. With Tal, I mean, my joke was they probably arrested the guy for committing too little fraud. I think the issue was he was committing fraud for his own benefit, not the benefit of everybody else. But Tal, I mean, we wrote the report. It's clear. I mean, Tal claimed to have sold the company and then reacquired it and booked $50 million profit on that. They never even sold the company. I mean, it's obvious. This was a total fraud. Or I'm sorry, Tal is not a total fraud, but that transaction was. But again, if the SEC can't investigate, the directors in China are all in on this stuff. So the problem is our system relies, good faith of directors, which, I mean, even in a U.S. based company, they have a lot of disincentive not to investigate these things because It's like, hey, if you find fraud, guess what? Years of litigation. You're going to be dealing with your D&O company. Am I covered? It's going to suck for you. Your reputation is, going to be in the dirt. So you don't want to find fraud if you're a director, sitting in the U.S. either. But in China, they're all in on it. This is the ecosystem, right? And, since so many of these companies are committing fraud, and I have a higher level explanation as to why they do. I mean, I had a self-storage business in China, so it never got big by any means. But what I learned as a lawyer there and doing business there, it is the most competitive, difficult place in the world to do business, because the moment you start making money, all these guys with access to capital who, their whole way of thinking is, I might be in business for only 6 months, but I'm going to knock this guy's business model off. I'm going to underprice him, and I'm just going to take market share. And I'm going to make sure that I recoup my costs in a very short period of time. Then I'm going to throw this business away, and I'm going to move on to the next business. And that works because the China market is still so price sensitive. It's not. I mean, on an individual level, it is not a rich country. So you have that dynamic of extreme competition, but with access to capital. So it's hard for any business to really remain standing, for long there. Then you have the state-owned enterprises who want to eat your lunch anyway. Then you have all the officials who are up for sale to your competitors, who will put you out of business if you're not, rendering unto a Caesar who can protect you. So it's really hard to actually scale a business that in China and make real profits there. So everything has to be bullshit, basically, in terms of these companies that are selling themselves to outside investors. Now, the manufacturers, a lot of private sector manufacturers were able to do that. But, when you're talking about internet TMT companies that are branded, I mean, it's such a difficult business environment that there aren't many real stories that you could tell public company investors. They're only fairy tales. The economy there does not work like it does here. So that's why you have this ecosystem that brings fraudulent companies to market. Everybody's in on it. All the directors, the banker, the top bankers, the top lawyers, the auditors. This is how they put food on the table. And this is the problem. I mean, there's no solution for us other than to say, you know what, you just can't list here.